Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Scarsdale annual Food for Thought event. I'm Leah Demitzer, I'm the president of the Scarsdale League, and I'm so happy that all of you could join us tonight. I know we have parents, students, and teachers watching this Zoom. We're all amidst a tumultuous time in our history, in our country, and I just want to take a minute and say I'm with you. I know every day is a challenge, but we're all just trying to make it through together. As we watch our various governmental processes unfold, as well as challenges to our norms and institutions, we know that civic education, informing and educating our country's citizens and residents about how our government works is paramount. In this pivotal historical moment, it is essential that our students are empowered to be informed and active citizens in our democracy. This evening, we welcome 6 special guests. Dinora Getachew, the former executive director of Generation Citizen. We have Martin Mintz, the program manager at Generation Citizen. Generation Citizen is an organization that goes into schools and helps support students and gives them the tools to be active and engaged citizens. We also have John Harrison, the social studies department chair at Scarsdale High School. Stephen Goodman, a social studies 8th grade teacher at Scarsdale Middle School. And we are lucky to have 2 students in the student government at Scarsdale High School. We have Simran Ruta, who is a senior, and she's the vice president of the class of the student government. And we have Claire Scarcella, who is an 11th grader, and she is the vice president of her class, or the president of her class, I'm sorry. The League of Women Voters of Scarsdale prioritizes civic engagement and education. In fact, we just finished going to the middle school virtually with our Civics Jeopardy. Much to my 8th grade son's horror, I helped facilitate Civics Jeopardy in his 8th grade social studies class. But he said I didn't embarrass him too much, which was good. So the Scarsdale League is celebrating nearly 100 years. In 2021, we celebrate 100 years of local activism and community engagement. We are an organization that grew out of the suffrage movement in 1914, and up until the League's founding in 1921, we had a very active suffrage community in Scarsdale, and they were actively working to win the right for women to vote in public elections. Today, the League of Women Voters fights against voter suppression in its various and insidious forms. We encourage political engagement at the national, the state, the county, and the local level. We are a nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose any candidates for public office. However, we are political in that we take positions on selected governmental issues after serious member study and consensus. So before I hand it over to Dinora, who's going to be our moderator this evening, I just want to tell you, Dinora, I first heard you speak in 2019 in the summer at the League of Women Voters of New York convention, and I was enthralled and inspired by the work that you do, and that you did as Generation Citizen, and that you do in your advocacy. And I'm really thrilled. I know that the League of Women Voters of Scarsdale is thrilled to have you and Martin here, and all the teachers, and Claire and Simran. So thank you. And now I will turn it over to Dinora.
Thank you so much, Leah, for having me here this evening and for the opportunity to engage in an important and timely post-election conversation as we really think about action civics and the state of civic engagement and youth civics education in our democracy here in New York State and beyond, right? I think so much of what's at stake in this moment as we reflect on the election over a week ago where there was record voter turnout, right? You know, I was looking at stats earlier today in preparation for this conversation, and 65% of Americans have voted in this election, 65% of eligible Americans, which equates to about 75 million voters. The last time that we had that many Americans of every age, persuasion, socioeconomic status, race, gender, et cetera, participate is at least 50 years ago, but we believe it may be as long as 100 years ago. So that's a win for democracy. And I, you know, Martin knows me well enough from our days together at Generation Citizen. I love to take a little victory lap every once and again. And I think taking a victory lap for democracy is important, right? Otherwise, why are we here on a Thursday evening in the fall if we're not excited and fired up about the power of democracy? Beyond that, I'm excited and fired up, and I always am, about the power of young people to shape that democracy, right? If I were showing slides and being a little bit more boring and wonky, I would say in past years, young people are a growing percentage of our electorate, but they don't always use their voice and they don't actually actively participate in the record numbers that they could. We didn't see that this year. Young people turned out in record numbers, and between the 2016 election and the 2020 presidential election, 16 million more Americans became eligible to vote who are young people. That is so powerful. Anybody who's ever heard me speak knows that I like to say I'm millennial adjacent, which means I think I know how to use technology well, but I'm not quite a millennial. The reality is I'm a Gen Xer, and that's a smaller generation when I compare that to the boomers at the other end of the spectrum. Millennials, Zennials, the young people who are in charge and are coming into power and of age in this democracy in this moment are the current and future. And that's what's so exciting. And I'm proud and honored to be here this evening with all of you to talk about the state of civics education in New York and what we all can be doing to really continue to activate, engage, empower these young people so they can shepherd this democracy so that we can have 100% participation at some point. So where are we in this moment? We just had this record election last week, record participation, which is also, again, it's like good and bad, right? Because you're like 67%, like you'd fail the test, right? Or you'd barely pass. But for America, that's a victory lap, right? And so we should take that, but we also should be doing more. And so we're living through this pandemic. It's an incredibly disrupted time. Our lives immediately flipped on the switch to being online, education happening online, social interactions happening online. And what we know is that there's also this civic, which I've been talking about for a long time, this civic reckoning. Like, how do we make our democracy better? How do we keep marching and working towards this more perfect union? And I mean that in the most broad sense of the word and most inclusive. Like, it is not the instant gratification, right, that we're all used to. Like, can I order the dinner? Can I retweet the thing? The work of democracy is the work of continual and systemic change. So how do we continue to live through that civic reckoning? And some good things are happening in New York in that regard. Then you layer on top of that this public health crisis and the reckoning that it hastened as it relates to racial, right? We all talk about racial reckoning, and I believe in that as a woman of color. But we also need to talk about a gender reckoning, right? Like, we have a historic moment that we're living in right now, where we will see if we will have the first vice presidential elect woman in American history. But yet there are record numbers of women stepping off the career ladder because of this pandemic and its impact on themselves and their family as they work to educate kids and take care of their families. And so we think about that cocktail that's brewing and what that means for our democracy. What we know is that New York has taken some great steps forward, right? So during the last legislative session, New York State became another state that adopted automatic voter registration, getting rid of barriers to voting. So for young people, like Claire and Simran, they don't have to think about, where's the voter registration form? What do I do with it? What's the stamp? Who do I mail it to? How do I get on the registrar? Like, what do I do? Instead, once they become driving age eligible and get their first state issued ID, they will automatically be registered. So that's a win for democracy, getting rid of barriers. We perfected or are honing our early voting in New York. And we were, big wins, I think, thinking about how to create a system for public financing of elections so that more everyday New Yorkers can run for office. I happened to sit on a panel that allocated, upwards $50 to $100 million to create a system like that. And then last but not least, there's this real civic reckoning moment where New York State realized that they needed to be doing better by young people and really empowering them, educating them to get the knowledge and skills they need to participate in this 21st century democracy. And so with all of that in the foreground, I'm excited to talk to educators, students, civic leaders and advocates and policy leaders like Martin and the teachers and students here today, just about what is happening right now and what can we all be doing now that election day is behind us. So continue that momentum, right? None of us should go home and take the nap for the rest of the next 4 years. So everybody can take a break, but you got to get back in the game. So I want to engage us in a thoughtful conversation about what does it take to forge that path ahead. But before we do that, we want to get a pulse check of where we are. So Martin, are we ready to engage in that part of the discussion? Martin's giving me the thumbs up. See, I'm the television host here, Denora Gatacho, at your service. In the chat, you will see a link to an app called Menti. I want you to click on that link. And then you're going to enter the code 677115. When you get that, pull it up on screen. It's going to offer you 2 questions, and we want to talk through what we're hearing in this moment. Really get a pulse check on where we all are. Martin's going to put it up on screen. So I'm going to stop talking. Martin's going to take it from here and make sure that we're all feeling where we are in this moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Denora. Yes. So I think hopefully everybody can see my screen Great. So yes, right now you'll just see the first question and, oh, great, already one's popping up. But if you click on that link, you should start to see, or you should be able to just enter a response to this question. Other than voting, what is one way you can make a difference in your community? And then it's gonna auto-populate your own responses here. If you're having trouble getting to this page that you see on the screen, feel free to just drop your response in the chat as well, and I can just read them aloud, but nice to have them all in one place. Volunteering, saw that a couple times. Write letters to a local paper, write for a local paper, like I love seeing like op-eds or something like that. Contacting elected officials to hold them accountable. Organize political gatherings, participation in campaigns. Protests, organizing, yes. Become and help others become informed about issues. Yes, these are all great things that can happen. And the list keeps coming. Great. Volunteer in an organization whose goal is to affect change. Teach young people. Advocating for a policy solution.
I have some responses in the chat, Martin. Organized drive,
yeah.
Hold issue discussions. I love that. Safely though, we're gonna hold them socially distant and safe, or via the Zoom or with the mask. But yes, we should be doing that.
Awesome. I mean, you can see, like, as these responses roll in, clearly, I mean, obviously voting is top of mind for all of us right now, and for good reason. But there's certainly, when you think about how to make a difference in your community, and again, you can define community however you want to. There's so much that can happen. Run for office, yes, exactly. So we'll just jump into the next question. Thank you all for your responses. And this one's a little bit different. It's just asking you for some words. So this says, what is one word that you would use to describe the state of youth civic engagement in New York? I think it'll give you a chance to add 3 separate words, but as you add those, it's going to create a word bubble for all of these. So, Denora obviously was talking a little bit earlier about what we see with youth voting. But obviously, as we talked about in the previous question, there's so much more to talk about. So I'll give it a little bit. There we go.
I think I cheated. I did a hyphenated word.
Change oriented. I like it.
Simran or Claire, anybody, even, Steve, John, anything jump out to you? Are you guys filling it in? Are you participating? I'd love to hear your thoughts here too, as this word cloud forms.
I'm stunned.
Stunn's a good word. I'm getting excited.
It's evolving. Great.
Morphing even before our eyes.
Yeah.
Charged. That's a good word. Growing. Oh, I like growing.
And for the word cloud, the larger the word is, the more times it's popped up. So growing is one of the, I guess, growing words.
Oh. Is that improving? Is that what that says?
Yeah, improving.
Mm.
So maybe give it a little bit more time. But I think what's interesting about this is that you see a lot of things that are like what I guess I would say positive words, right? Excited, energized, inspired. But you also see like more action. So things that are changing, evolving, improving, change oriented, and then some malleable, and then some other ones like apathetic on the other side of the line.
Curious was in the chat and charged. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you, Denora.
Of course, we're tag teaming, Martin.
So it seems like the word, oh, there we go, a couple more.
Hopeful. Future. Superficial. I want to get to the root of that one. Developing.
Seems like we've got the end of the word bubble growing. Happy to either stop sharing, Denora, or you let me know if you
Yeah.
want to.
I think that's right. I mean, Claire and Simran, I kind of want to put you on the spot because you're the young people that we're talking about. Any words jump out to you from this, or words that you don't see reflected that you would love to be a part of this conversation before we get into the official panel part of this?
I think I would definitely like to highlight the word energized, because I think something beautiful about younger generations voting is people are now more excited and feel like they actually have a real voice. So this, I think there's more growing numbers because people are more excited and energized to make a difference.
Yeah, and I also like the word activated, because I feel like, especially in light of this election, I don't think this youth vote is going to go away. I think it's just going to continue increasing after this election, especially.
You heard it here first, everybody. Not going away. This is what I want to hear. This is why I'm here tonight, why I'm ignoring those lovely children of mine. So this is what's going to keep me fired up for sure. This is great. Martin, is there a way to save a copy of this or to export this?
I can do that.
Would be great to share around, especially with the league if they want to. I mean, it'll be included in the recording, but I love seeing these data visualizations, and it gives us something to look forward to and ground us as we start this conversation tonight. And again, thanks for facilitating that part of the check-in, right? The teacher and you, Martin. So we didn't do the bios in great detail, but just, I'll give a plug for Martin, who is an educator. He taught 7th grade social studies in the South Bronx for 7 years. And so he still has that in him. And I love when he gets the ability to bring his best teacher A game to the table. So thanks for doing that, Martin.
Yeah,
and he actually is a millennial, unlike me. So I was like, I don't know how to facilitate the Mency, please do it. So I want to kick us off in this conversation tonight and really ground us in why we're here. And for the first part of this conversation, we're really going to focus on the middle school level. And I want to start really with Stephen and Martin in particular. And so the others, you're definitely welcome to stay on screen if you'd like, or if you want to turn your cameras off for this part, I'm happy to cue you when it's time. But Martin and Stephen in particular want this conversation to be with the two of you and really thinking about what does civic engagement, civics education really look like at the middle school level? And Stephen, I'll start with you as you're a middle school teacher at Scarsdale Middle School. I'd love to hear you tell us about your social studies instruction at the middle school level and how you incorporate civics education for, those middle school students.
Absolutely. I've started, this is my 20th year in Scarsdale Middle School. I taught 7th grade for the majority of that. The last few years I've been teaching 8th grade, and I've started every year with the same opening line as kids walk into my classroom for the first time. Hi, I'm Mr. Goodman. Please turn to the Constitution. I love to lead with this unit. I think it provides a great framework for everything that follows in both the 7th and 8th grade level. I'm finding a lot more natural inroads as an 8th grade teacher, but it's a very nuts and bolts approach. The kids are getting familiar with the Constitution and learning how to navigate it, learning how to read it and get comfortable with its language. And then they're learning the real nuts and bolts of our American government, terms of office, qualifications, methods of election, what each article of the Constitution is about, and the layout and structure. So it's a great vehicle for study skills at this point in the year, but it also provides a framework for everything that follows later in the year. It's something that we can keep looping back to as the unit progresses. It becomes more conceptual when we're talking more about the role of the citizen and founding principles, how the branches interact. But we'll start the year with that. And the first couple of months of my course is devoted to American government. And then it's something that we'll loop back to throughout the year. We'll keep revisiting it. It's not like we just put it away and, that's it. We're constantly returning to it.
So it's grounding it in the civic knowledge, right? In the historic texts. And I think that's so powerful, right? Because one component of how this country was founded and really the origins of it was actually that the Constitution is a complex, and democracy is a complex political system. And if we don't understand it, we don't know how to leverage the power that is baked in it, right? I think if I'm speaking, colloquially on a Thursday evening, can you tell us more though about then how do you engage the young people to take that text and then understand that it's a text that's accessible to them and that they can use to really engage with society, right? And do the protesting and do the advocacy. Because it's one thing to understand the words. It's another to say, like, there's the legislative branch. How do I engage with them?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do at this point is establish a knowledge base, make it fun and relevant, make them pique their interest at this point. At the middle school level, we do a mock election, thanks to our friends from the League of Women Voters. So they're engaging in the ritual and pageantry of voting. We do this every year, even in the kind of yawner of election years like last year. But I know.
I can't let you call any election year a yawner. That's like hurting my democracy
I know,
ninja
but there was a lot of like
sensibilities.
uncontested judges and stuff, but it was still important, and that's why we do it every year. And I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you for correcting me. I needed that. But we do this mock election, and we research the different public offices and the public officials who are running. And I think it's important that we do it every year and not just in federal elections. So the kids coming through the middle school experience will vote in 6th and 7th and 8th grade, and they're kind of being programmed that every year is election year. So that's one thing. The League of Women Voters have been coming in and running this great election game. Leah, you did a great job with that. We'll do a Constitution comic project where the kids get to synthesize what they're learning and make kind of a cool cartoon out of it. So I think it's important to keep it fun, relevant, hopeful. There's plenty of time for, Zinn and Chomsky when they get a little bit older. I think it's more about just piquing their interest and getting an established knowledge base.
Yeah, and you also talked about, I like the connection between civics and art, right? And like, how do you be expressive about your civic engagement? And then I love this notion of developing the right civic habits, right? So I was, being a little bit tongue in cheek about the sleeper elections, but every election matters and all politics is local. So it's really important when we think about where power rests, how decisions are made, that young people and adults for that matter understand that the local elections is what drives the resources to your community for the soup kitchen or for the potholes, fire departments, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's important to make sure that we don't only focus on the shiny, glossy federal elections.
Yeah, and not only the presidential election also.
Exactly.
The myth is that the president is the savior of the country, and they're co-equal branches, and it's important to pay attention to that also.
Absolutely. Martin, I want to bring you in so you're not off the hook here. I know you're sitting there, you're really doing well, you're nodding, you're engaged, but I want to hear your reaction. Like, how does what Stephen described about his pedagogical approach resonate with what you did as a middle school teacher, but also your experience as a program manager and Generation Citizen? So you're going to have to do the GC 101 because that's not my job anymore. And then tell us, how does that compare?
Yeah, for sure. And I think kind of through both of those, definitely a lot resonated with me. I think first is, exactly what you started off with, the idea of that civic knowledge and making sure students actually understand something that is quite complex. Like, democracy is complex. And
you weren't going to say it.
We need to. I'm going to quote
It's a full contact sport. We need to say it. Don't you you were almost there.
I was going to say we need to demystify democracy. Another one of Denora's infamous quotes, but that is, like, honestly, that is, I think, one of the most important things that when I think of what you were saying, and then also what happens inside of a Generation Citizen classroom, it's important. And I think thinking back to my own experience in the classroom, that idea of when students are able to put themselves into what they're learning, whether that's through their own creativity and creating, a comic book, or through practicing the act of an election, when students are able to see themselves in that, whatever that is, it becomes quite powerful. And yes, also happy to give a little bit of what is Generation Citizen. So I guess let me back up a second and just real quickly, Generation Citizen. So we're a national nonprofit. I'm the program manager for the New York site. So we work in New York City and in some school districts across New York State. But our goal really with what we do is to transform how civics education is taught through what we call our Action Civics pedagogy. It's a project-based, student-centered education. And the whole goal is that we're equipping young people with the civic skills, civic knowledge, and dispositions for lifelong civic engagement.
And so, Martin, what does that look like in a classroom? Because you just told me a lot of like really exciting words and they were good. I don't know what that means. If I walk
What
in
does
a
it mean?
classroom,
Yes.
if I'm a parent, oh wait, I am a parent. I walk in that classroom, what's going to happen?
Yeah. So what happens in the classroom is students, what they're doing is going through a process. We call it our advocacy hourglass, but it's a process where you start by analyzing your own community, figuring out what are the issues in my community, what are the assets. They analyze those issues and actually end up building consensus on one specific issue in their community. Again, you can define community however you want to. That could be your classroom, your school, your neighborhood, your city, your state. We do say that it should be a local community, so anything basically state and below. But once students decide on their issue, they get to start engaging in what we call participatory action research. So identifying, we know this problem exists, but why does that problem exist? That could happen through reaching out to guest speakers, local community members, and doing research through that. But the whole idea is that by doing that research, you identify a policy-aligned goal to actually take action on this issue. And then around the second half of the curriculum, they are actually putting an action plan into action. So all this happens over the course of a semester traditionally. Happy to give an example of what might happen last year. I think usually examples kind of help ground all that I just said. But one example that comes to mind is a class that we worked with in a neighborhood in Queens last year. They looked at their neighborhood, identified a lot of the assets that they had. One of the issues they defined was that the streets around their school were dirty. There was lots of trash around their streets. So they know the problem exists. They went through participatory action research to figure out why. So why is this problem happening? They identified two reasons why. One reason would be was that like the vendors in the area, so like the food vendors, the street vendors around their school were leaving behind trash. Another reason was that there was a lack of sanitation workers and a lack of funding to actually address that issue. So they kind of went around this in a few different ways, but what they did afterwards, they ended up advocating for policy around there to be daily scheduled cleanings around their neighborhood and around their school, but also accountability for vendors to keep their streets clean. So a part of that, they say, okay, so these are the things we want. What is that going to take? It ended up looking like they were advocating for budget allocations specifically for those actions. They were actually able to meet with their council member at our Civics Day, which is the end of semester event. Think of it kind of like a science fair for civics, but all the classes that participated in Generation Citizen over the course of the semester come together, share what they've been able to do, but they were actually able to meet with their council member and who was really excited and actually committed to helping them see it through. So, that's an exciting example and an example where you see students identifying an issue and going through the process and successfully advocating for their goal. But at the end of the day, that's not, obviously we celebrate things like that, but what we really measure is what I was really talking to at the beginning was, what are students' civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic disposition? So how are you growing with those? Because at the end of the day, the goal are leaving this semester with these experiences, with that lifelong civic education, or with the idea that they have lifelong civic engagement.
No, I really appreciate that. Stephen, I want to hear more from you about how that, now I want to hear you react. Like, how does that resonate with you and, your pedagogical practice in the middle school level, and even just how civics education is changing or evolving in light of where we are with this activated group of young people?
Well, first of all, Martin, that sounds super cool. Everything just kind of blew my mind. I've done such a scaled down version of that, like with having kids research a public issue of their choosing and then writing a letter to a public official as a writing project, as opposed to like just kind of a static essay. And it's kind of really cool when they get the letter, back. I had one student who laced into an American president. I won't say which one, but really, I had to like tone down their letter. Like really tone it down, so it was focused on their policy. And the kid got a letter back. It was like, "You're terrible. You should resign," or whatever it was. And then he gets a letter back, like an autographed picture of the president's dog. "Thank you. It's so great to hear from young people." But I think what you're talking about, sounds amazing. But how has it evolved? We live in a really hyper political time. So I feel like I have to be more careful about what I say in this kind of post-fact, post-truth, world where there's just not as much objective well, there is objective truth, but like, for example, today, kids were like, "Mr. Goodman, who won the election?" And like, am I being partisan by saying Joe Biden won it? Or what's the deal with the voter fraud? Well, there's no evidence of it. Am I being partisan by saying that? I'm starting to hear rumblings of how we shouldn't teach civic education because we're somehow indoctrinating the kids, or so that part I think has changed. To hear people, maybe it's maybe just the beginning of these kinds of rumblings, but to hear people question what we're doing, or to hear a kid, I shared a New York Times article and a kid knee-jerk reaction was, "That's fake news." Now, this was an article from 1898 about the destruction of the Maine. Okay, so I think that's the line I'm walking in a public school. I think it's important to be objective. I think it's important to at least maintain the illusion of objectivity. I certainly feel I feel how I feel myself, and I have my own personal opinions about politics. But I think that's what I've seen in my 20 years as a teacher.
Well, I think it's interesting that you raised some of the questions and concerns around polarization in this moment, right? And like, what does it mean to engage in research and critical thinking skills and writing? And so Martin can see where I'm gonna go with the layup I'm hoping to give him around how does Generation Citizen bring that work into the classroom? But the one editorial comment I would make in this moment is, in New York State, the regents have said this is a priority for civic learning to happen in schools. Their goal is for every student to graduate civic ready from high school by time they graduate, right? And so I was a part of a task force of individuals throughout the state, various backgrounds, academics, practitioners, judges, attorneys, maybe I checked a couple of boxes there, of really thinking about what does civics education mean in the 21st century? Like, what are the mindsets, behaviors, dispositions, knowledge, and skills that students need to engage with in order to be civic ready, right? Because again, the wonky Denora, the ninja for democracy here would just say, our country was founded, public education was founded on the premise that people were gonna learn how to be good citizens, right? They were gonna understand those governing texts, as you talked about earlier. And so I would just be curious to know, as we think about those new standards, which are going to come into play in the 21-22 school year, of like beginning to pilot what does civic readiness mean and creating this seal of civic readiness that students can achieve on their diploma when they graduate. What is it that Generation Citizen does and others in the field, Martin, that really gears towards some of this intentional learning, understanding, critical research thinking skills, research and thinking skills, and better argumentation that gets us out of this polarization, out of this sense of fake news and fact versus fiction, but really into consensus building and making better arguments?
All right, trouble unmuting myself. No, it's a great question, Jordan. I think, when we think about the work that happens inside citizen classrooms, and I'm sure many other classrooms around the state, that is really one of the most important things that we see happening when students are able to not just talk about these things, but actually use their own voice to to kind of put those issues into play. We really think, the instruction, the learning of civics, the learning of government, in order to really understand how democracy functions, just like you would with learning math or learning, a science experiment. Why should it be any different with civics, right? You learn by doing. And whether that's talking with somebody you might disagree with, or sharing your own perspective or your own point of view, that takes practice, and it takes something that we really should be embedded inside of schools. And really excited to see what happened on the state level within the Department of Education, really taking steps to address, not only civics education, but the different acts to civics education that is meaningful, that is project-based, and that is really going to impact students to become stay active, engaged participants in our democracy.
Martin was cutting up a little bit there, at least on my end, but hopefully we got what he said, which is, no, it's okay. The importance of making sure that students are getting access to project-based civic learning and that they're acquiring the knowledge and skills in schools, right? So Beth Lambert asked a good question, which is like, previous generations have let this slip, and it's important to engage young people now. Is there a drive somehow to strengthen civic engagement and understanding as families, right? And so the initiative at the state level is really geared at what happens in that pre-K to 12, but really in the 12th grade, which we're going to turn to in a moment. So I'm just giving the other panelists a heads up that in the next 2 to 3 minutes, you're going to come on screen. We're going to have the high school portion of this conversation. But there is this effort to make sure that before students graduate from high school, they are civic ready, right? What is also important is to think about, yes, where does the civic engagement come as a family, right? How do you build the right civic habits? How do you make sure that as a family, you're engaging in those rituals and that you're demystifying democracy at home? Generation Citizen has some resources on its website, and I know there are countless other organizations, including the League, that have done this. And so I would check some of those out, right? Like Generation Citizen has an entire initiative called Democracy Doesn't Pause that has resources that are available for caregivers to have facilitated conversations around the dinner table, right? Because we're all around that dinner table together much more than we used to be. Let's talk about what democracy means and how we demystify it, and then let's go take the next step. So I think there's something really powerful to be said there, and I appreciate Beth for raising that question, because it isn't, democracy starts at home, right? And sometimes the work of democracy is too much for us, and we get exhausted by that. But there are ways that we can model the right civic behaviors at home, in addition to reinforcing what's happening in a school climate. Martin, before we move on to the high school conversation, anything more you want to say about the Democracy Doesn't Pause, or how to continue that civic engagement beyond this election season?
Yeah, thank you, Denora. And yeah, I just dropped the link to the Democracy Doesn't Pause resources in the chat. But I think, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that is something that we, kind of created it out of necessity. It was a response to what was happening when, March, changed how learning was happening, and really thinking about how that could really bring in caregivers in a way that is something that can really support the whole family. So I think that is something, I'm glad you brought that up. I appreciate it.
I want to turn to talking to myself on mute, but I'm unmuted now. Turn us to the high school portion of this conversation. And thanks so much, Simran, Claire, and John, for joining us back on screen. Stephen, you're welcome to stay on screen, or you want to hang out in the background. Totally, whatever makes you feel comfortable. I like seeing this background that you have, so it's bringing me energy. So I'm happy to keep looking at it. But I want to engage us now. Let's shift gears a little bit for the high school portion of this conversation, right? I'm sure many of you, parents, caregivers, young people out there, educators, regents who are with us, want to also think about, what does this mean for older young people, right? Who may be of voting age or closer to voting age and have had a real chance to practice those civic habits for a little bit longer. And I want to, again, pick up on the thread. Beth is getting all my love right now. So thanks, Beth, to really think about, the young portion of this conversation, but then how do you have the conversation at the older level? And I just would love to hear, John, if you want to start off and just tell us about your experience as a high school social studies teacher at Scarsdale High, and participation in government. What does that feel like How does that compare to what you may have heard Martin describe about Action Civics?
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for this program. This is really wonderful, and I really enjoy getting a chance to talk with everybody. So I've been at Scarsdale High School 25 years now. So I have sort of been here a while to see the sort of evolutionary changes over time in terms of how we do civic education. I think one of the hallmarks, though, of at least the Scarsdale approach has been that we take the New York State requirement, participation in government, which has that awful sort of, nickname pig. And what we have done over the last many years now is really taken that and allowed teachers to develop courses that have a particular focus around various aspects of civic engagement. And so if you look at our course catalog, one of the things I'm particularly proud of is that we've got courses entitled things like Piecing It Together, Global Citizenship in the 21st Century, Living in America, Food for Thought, and City 2.0, which is a urban policy course. And all of these courses are designed to fulfill the New York State requirement for government and economics, but really to focus a lot on what Martin was talking about in terms of civic engagement. We really sort of move beyond just simply teaching students about the three branches of government, checks and balances, about, the qualifications to be a senator or to be a House member, but rather to think about what their role is, either as a member of a local community or as a member of a broader, more global community. And the assessments and the activities and the projects have really focused on having students engage in really hands-on work. And so we've been kind of, ahead of the curve in some respects on this. It does come with the following caveat, though, which is that, I don't run my kids through a memorization test on the Constitution. I grew up in Chicago, and I remember in high school taking a 100 multiple choice question on the Constitution, which included things like, what was the emoluments clause or something like that. We have taken the decision that really grinding, no offense here, Steve, grinding into the Constitution can really be a deadening experience for a 12th grader, and that therefore the curriculum really needs to focus on sort of having students kind of embrace the idea of civic engagement through a kind of more intentional curriculum. And then at the advanced topics level, I should also talk about our AT program. Denora asked me, the difference between AT and AP, and perhaps some of you on the webinar here are not familiar that Scarsdale High School does not teach the advanced placement program, because that is actually a trademark program that is run by the College Board that is directly linked to a test. But now, more than 10 years ago, we went to an advanced curriculum at Scarsdale, which has allowed courses like, for example, Simran's in my AT US government course, to really embrace the kind of deep investigation of local or global or national issues that wouldn't necessarily appear in a College Board exam in May, but would really be incredibly important, is really incredibly important for having students understand civic life in the United States. And then lastly, I want to just also, and I'll stop here because I really want to have Claire and Simran speak. Another thing that I'm particularly proud of is that, and those of you in the community who are listening know that Scarsdale High School students have done some really remarkable work over the last several years in terms of responding to national issues. After the Parkland shooting at Marjorie Stillman Douglas School, we had a spontaneous student-led, student-organized walkout. That wasn't run by teachers, that was run by students. We've had a group of students go to the school board to talk about the Title IX changes that have happened at the federal level, which have been incredibly important, as well as students highly engaged in what the structure of their school should look like during this pandemic. And so those, I think, are actually sort of markers of how far we've gone. And I don't want to take credit for this. This is the work that Steve and the good people at the middle school sort of build in over successive years. And of what I get to the high school, because I teach 11th and 12th graders, is to kind of, really drink up all the good work that these people have put in. It's just sort of been a wonderful experience. But anyhow, that's just a little flavor of what we're doing here at the high school.
And I love that little flavor, right? Because it's one of the things that we debated a lot and talked a lot about through the Civic Readiness Task Force. Like, should this be a two-step sequence, right? That you're getting this first touch of civic engagement. Maybe it's more knowledge-based at the middle school level, but hopefully has some of the civic skill development and project-based learning that Martin talked about. And then as a rite of passage, right? If maybe that's happening in 6th or 8th grade, and then in high school, you're getting it again, right? When you can telescope out some more, the world is a little bit bigger and you can dive into meatier issues. And so I want to bring Simran and Claire into this discussion because I'd love to hear their perspective on how, and this is not, with all due respect to John and the Scarsdale High School School District, I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, but I'd like to hear your perspective on AT-PIG. And, is it preparing you in particular, Simran, to participate in democracy? Like, are you age eligible or eligible enough to vote in this past election? And did you feel like what happened in that classroom gave you the knowledge and skills you needed, right? Because I think about PIG is very analogous to me, and I hate the singing, but I do it because it's kind of funny. We all remember, some of us remember Schoolhouse Rock, right? I'm just a bill on cat. And then what, right? Like, are you going to tweet about that? Like, what does learning PIG do to teach you how to participate in democracy, right? So I'd love to hear your perspective on that class. And again, this is, we'll make sure John doesn't hold it against you, but I just want to engage and understand what can we do better or continue to do that's working already.
Well, Mr. Harrison knows I love his class. It's one of my favorites that I've ever taken in all of high school. But I wouldn't attribute my entire understanding of American democracy to this class, because I do think that the middle school has done and even starting in elementary school, has done a really good job equipping me, like from the moment that I started learning about how our government works till now. So I think what I value most about the AT Gov class is not, because we're not learning like the 3 branches of government. We're not learning the basic stuff. We're learning a broader scope. Like our most recent lesson is on the media, which I saw someone had a question about.
You just let young people lead, because she's going to facilitate the questions. Simran's got this. I will keep drinking my water. Yes, please bring in that question, Simran. I want you to do that. Go for it.
Yeah, let me find it. Is there a way to address media literacy among young people, as the press is considered a 4th branch of government? That was our lesson today, and social media plays a larger and larger role. Yeah, so we hadn't really talked about the media as the 4th branch of government until today. Although I would say that a lot of people my age are well aware of the fact and of the role that media plays in the government, because we are in the age of social media, and we're seeing a lot of impassioned students posting on Instagram, posting on TikTok, posting on all these social media forums about their political opinions. And it's really opening up a lot of discussion, I think. We are in polarizing times, so discussion might be a light word because it can get more aggressive than that. But I do think that these discussions that we're having across social media, these discussions that we're having in classes that are beyond the scope of what American government is and more focusing towards what American government can be, is well equipping us for the future.
Claire, do you want to come in on this? And I would like to also just add into that question, right? Because one of the things I talk a lot about is like not becoming slacktivists, right? Like I want young people to understand the role of technology and being able to fuel social movements and catalyze them, but it is in and of itself not the solution. And so how do we both understand what are true and factual sources, and then also how do we leverage technology towards fueling that effort? And then John, definitely you and Stephen, I would love for you to come in on the back end of Claire's response, and Martin as well, to just think about pedagogically, how do you put those guardrails on? Thanks for bringing in the question, Simran, by the way.
So I think a lot of students make the mistake of believing everything that they see. And I think the school and maybe other sources have taught students that they should look at multiple sources, because even the most accurate news source could be a little bit more biased to one certain side. So I think a lot of students have become more and more aware of the bias behind certain medias, and especially things like Instagram. And I think a huge issue among students is following the crowd. So I think students suddenly start to really be passionate about something because their friends are doing it, not necessarily because they believe it. But I think school does a really well. I have not taken the course that Simran is taking right now, because I'm only 11th grader, but so far our discussions in class have equipped us really well to understand what is going on with current events. So I think it's helping kids have a better understanding of not maybe to only follow the bias of social media, but to look farther and become more passionate because they actually want to, not to just follow the crowds.
And that's something we've seen in the class that I'm taking now too, because we'll watch a clip from CNN, but then we'll also watch a clip from Fox. So we're trying like maintaining the balance between both sides of the media, I think, is very important.
I would love to hear the educators talk about this from their perspective and how to engage that. And Martin, I think this is one of the things that Generation Citizen curriculum does well and really helping provide teachers with support to do. So please weigh in as well.
I think that I was going to Steve's question around sort of the culture of political intolerance. And I don't think I would describe it as political intolerance. I think there is cultural, I would say political anxiety around issues having to do with how to actually engage in political conversation. And the one thing that I think I'm spending more time doing now than perhaps 10, 15 years ago is really trying to be very explicit about how to model politically tolerant conversation. So, for example, really stopping for a moment, and even if there isn't a conservative voice in the room, making sure that the conservative voice at least gets expressed by me, where I will say, and a conservative might say X, right? Because I think that one of the things that is definitely true, and Steve, I think, is putting his finger on this, is that in the world of civic education, I think a lot of teachers in the climate that we live in oftentimes take 2 steps back. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think that we have to be very intentional about not sort of overcorrecting for a perception that somehow teachers may or may not be bringing political bias into their classes when it comes to civic education. But what Steve talks about is real. It's a professional challenge that is facing us right now. And I think the more we are sort of upfront about it and discuss it in meaningful ways, the more we can sort of move forward through this moment. Yeah.
So the answer is definitely not to just avoid the topic outright. I think that's right. And that was one of the things we confronted a lot through the Civic Readiness Task Force. And I will drop in the chat in a second just a link to those resources if the people are participating are not familiar, because there was a lot of discussion about that, right? The notion of political polarization, the fact that we don't engage in conversations anymore with people with different opinions than we do. And I think, again, I'm millennial adjacent, so I do use the social media. But if I don't like what someone has to say, it's easy for me to take Claire out of my feed, right? And I think that's the challenge in this moment, is that the cancel culture has taken us to a place where we aren't willing to engage in the robust debates, right? Again, here's Wonky Denora's coming. When the Constitution was being written, the founding fathers literally had very divergent views about what this Constitution, this grounding document would be. And if we go back and read the history on that, it wasn't that everybody had the same Kool-Aid on tap, just to be a little colloquial, right? They actually really debated the merits of how to form this notion of a democracy and how to make this document be one that is malleable and can evolve. And if they had in that time had social media, we may not have gotten to the place where we are now, 244 years later. And so I think it's important for us to be mindful of that. And then also really to think about, earlier, if anybody was on while the panelists were on before we started the formal discussion, I mostly disrespectfully, and I apologize for that, I didn't mean to in any way really imply that I'm a teacher, but as someone who homeschooled children earlier this year, I understood even more what it meant to be an educator. And it's not an easy thing, right? And I think the challenge is that the state hasn't, the state is catching up. And so they are putting out more resources for educators to help them do this work and engage in it. One, because caregivers and parents are demanding it. And two, because educators want to be doing the work, but want the right resources, frameworks, and curriculum to ground them. So Martin, I want to draw you in a little bit before we move on to another question, just to tell us a little bit about what Generation Citizen does in this regard and how does it provide resources and professional development to educators to think about media literacy and how to have difficult conversations and do critical thinking and research.
Yeah, I think it's such an important topic, and I think what y'all have been talking about, I think is both it's critical in this moment, but it's always been critical. I think it's just is kind of showing more and more now. And I think, speaking to what happens both in Generation Citizen classrooms and specifically with our professional development, we really embed the idea of media literacy, of controversial, like how to talk about controversial issues inside your classroom, because that's what's going to happen when you talk to students about what do you care about, what do you want to change. a lot of times controversial issues are going to come up. A lot of times there's going to be people who disagree. So how do you actually have those conversations in a way that is supportive and supported? So like, are the teachers supported to have those conversations with their students, and are they in a place to support their students with those conversations? And a huge part of that, really close to at the very beginning of the curriculum, after students have done a lot of issue identification, I think around lesson 4, they're actually going into build consensus. So they have to, as a group, decide what issue do we want to take action on? And it would be a lot easier if they voted on that issue. And we say that in the work itself, like, hey, yeah, you could vote, but then there's a winning side and a losing side. But this idea of building consensus, of being able to speak with people who you might not agree with, but also taking through that process, understanding others people's perspectives, and then use their perspectives to talk with them, to engage with them, and also try to convince them your perspectives. So have a conversation is really what it boils down to. It's not just me talking at you. I'm learning from you. And at the end of the day, a lot of times what happens is you maybe shift a little bit, but you build consensus. It's not an easy process. That's something that we definitely preface, and that teachers, I think, who've gone through GC will tell you it's not easy, but it is definitely worthwhile.
Martin, to hear you talk, I think about how important this work is, particularly because here at Scarsdale, our students are going off to college campuses where oftentimes the political discord, if it's shrill in a high school, it's even more shrill on a college campus. And having students armed with tools, that's probably not a good metaphor. Have tools in the toolbox. We don't be armed with tools, right? We want to have tools. There we go. I think it's a really important thing. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And I want to get to, I know both Simran, am I pronouncing it properly now? I apologize. And Claire, I have a very difficult last name that I inherited. And I always want to make sure I'm saying people's names properly. So I apologize for mispronouncing your name. I would love to hear, you both are in student government in the school. Tell us more about student decision-making. Because I think, often what Martin gave an example of what comes up in a Generation Citizen classroom, it is external issues, right, in the community, but sometimes it's curriculum. I think more and more, at least during my tenure, we had students working on projects that were about changing the curriculum in schools. And so I would love to hear your perspective as representative of student government and what type of issues you all are debating at the youth voice table.
Okay, so being on school government, I've had the opportunity to participate in the Dignity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, which started, I think, 2 years ago, but really picked up momentum this summer when a group of alumni also contacted me, but came together and decided that they were going to send a proposal to the district asking for a more inclusive anti-racist curriculum, removing certain texts, surrounding certain texts with other narratives, putting certain representation in curriculums, not just in history and English curriculums, but in math and science curriculums too, and just creating a more inclusive environment for the minorities in our school. So I was lucky enough to work with them over the summer, and then also bring their ideas to student government, where we created our own proposal, which was then submitted to the committee. So it's a very bureaucratic process. But so we've been reviewing that proposal for the past 2 or 3 months now. And I think we're finally bringing the decisions about the curriculum to a board meeting this Monday. So it's been really interesting to work with the committee. And also such a privilege as a student to hear the administrative decisions. And also, because on the committee, it's not just me, but there's a bunch of other students on it, and hearing their voices and hearing how the administration responds to those voices is very interesting.
Just to give a little context to what Simran just said, one of the things that we've done, I think, really effectively over the last few years, and our building principal, Ken Benamo, deserves a lot of credit for this, is bringing student voices onto high school committees. And I now sit on several committees where there are several students present. And that was something that's relatively that didn't exist 15 years ago. And it's a really refreshing change that I think has totally strengthened the sort of soft curriculum that we have, not the formal curriculum of the classroom, but some of the other sort of school-wide practices that we engage in. Yeah.
I would love to also talk about this because actually really recently, there a lot of students reached out to me because they were very upset with things that were being posted on Instagram. There was actually these hate accounts created, basically trying to expose students who didn't have this particular political view. So once those accounts were I was aware of them, I went and I spoke to administration and we discussed it with student government, and it was addressed and those accounts were immediately taken down. And I think people knowing that being able to reach out to the government, they can make a change. These things like the people aren't we're not allowing those accounts to be okay. And I think Scarsdale does a really good job of making a welcoming community for students. I don't think students are very afraid to speak up anymore. Even in the last 3 years, I think it's improved more and more. I also am lucky enough to sit on these committees, and I think every day I learn more about the school, and every day I get more and more comfortable to give my opinions and views. And I think as time goes on, that will only get stronger and more students will get involved.
It's so important, and that's the goal, right? It's like breaking down those barriers and making democracy, to Martin's point, that is my point, demystifying democracy so that it is in the hands of young people and all of us, right? I think if you don't understand how to access democracy, then it's hard for you to use democracy to advocate for the issues you care about, right? So I think it's really powerful to hear both of you speak about that, and then to really begin to develop those civic habits at the right time to be able to use them long term. I would love to hear, if there are other lessons or initiatives at the high school level that help students understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens. John, is that something that's going on in schools already? And then I will bring in the related question from Michael Otten, who talked about innovations around open primaries, ranked choice voting, nonpartisan redistricting, campaign finance reform. These are all the structural barriers topics I want to hear about. And I wonder how much that comes up in a classroom setting, either because you bring it up or the students bring it up.
Yeah. Well, in terms of sort of, getting the skills that students need to engage in civic participation, we do a lot of the things that Steve already talked about. It's happening at the middle school in terms of mock elections, in terms of, making elections part of the fall curriculum every year. And so that becomes an issue. In terms of the sort of the rights and responsibilities, I can't really speak about that in specific because I'm not necessarily the sort of student rights and responsibilities oftentimes falls inside the assistant principal's role, because that has to do with, say, adjudication of like school disciplinary codes or having kids sort of become restorative justice issues, right? These sorts of things, which oftentimes are not necessarily inside the standard curriculum. That's not to say they don't happen, by the way. I think they do happen quite a lot at Scarsdale, but I don't know whether I can speak about them with the level of texture that would be helpful. But I do know that there are lots of conversations around trying to have a school climate that is promoting the kind of civic values that we want to have kids see in the broader world. Yeah, I agree with that.
Stephen, anything you'd add on that topic or anything you think is relevant? Even at the middle school level, that's helping to layer in more of the discussion around rights and responsibilities and some of the structural reforms that could happen in democracy to help make it more accessible and inclusive and representative.
You're muted. There we go.
There's got to be one. There's got to be one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Again, not to cop out, but I think we're dealing with a bit more basic. Kids are struggling to remember that a term of office for a rep is 2 years. So we're not quite there yet. I think that the progression is, again, I'm establishing more of a basic knowledge base about how the system works, and then I kind of hand that off to the high school. Not to cop out, but
Not at all. I think the
that's
foundation has to be laid, and then it's a
the
layering.
kids aren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
Some are, but not all.
I think we covered, there were some questions I'm looking both between the chat and the Q&A around, the true history of the country and what extent, is truth being taught. We talked a little bit about that already. There was a question from Beth about the responsibility of a high school newspaper with regards to being fair and balanced in discourse. And I would be curious to know how much that overlaps with some of the things that are being taught in the classroom, right, around truth and media literacy. John or Simran or Claire, if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, the Maroon advisor, Kendra Clausen, is a colleague of mine in the social studies department, and she's done a remarkable job, in part because what the Maroon has really done is transferred into almost an online publication now, which is so responsive to student voices. I mean, I'll just give you one example, and I know because Simran was part of this discussion, was that the high schools had a huge discussion right now about the nature of the hybrid schedule. And students have been very engaged in the subject. But one of the things that I think the Maroon has done such a wonderful job, that's the name of our school newspaper, the Maroon. One of the things the Maroon has done so well is to provide a forum for kids to actually have an honest to God written debate over how the schedule should work. And kids actually had disagreements in print with each other. And these were not like sort of, now Mr. Harrison will assign you the homework of writing a letter to the Maroon. No, these kids actually went to the keyboard on their own initiative to write things to the Maroon about this issue. And you think about this, Martin, about sort of, you have to sort of learn how to do it on a small scale before you can do it on a big scale. The idea that you can have kids on their own initiative take up to writing to the school newspaper about a school issue, that's just simply that's the mustard seed right there, right? And then you just sort of let that thing germinate, and who knows where that can go. So anyhow, I think the Maroon has done, I think, a really remarkable job, particularly in the last 3 months. So I'll just shout out for the Maroon.
I love all the shout outs. There's a specific question for Claire and Simran around their thoughts on the power of curriculum and what is taught versus the instruction of how it's taught. Is it more about the textbook, right? This bill on Capitol Hill and memorizing the branches of government? I'm not going to sing again. Or the how it's taught, right? Like, is it action civics? Is it pedagogical? It's project-based and student-led. So curious about what your thoughts are from the youth perspective on what you're learning, how you're learning it, and how you'd like to be learning it. Thanks for the question, Edgar.
Well, I think it depends on how old you are and your understanding of the government. So I think in middle school, it is more, from what I remember, it's more textbook-based learning, which I think is helpful because you need that understanding of the basics of how our government works. But I think once you enter high school, there are more discussions. And I have found that those discussions are where I learn the most. I'm also a part of this group that's Westchester based. It's called Keepers of the Dream. It recently got restarted. Oh, have you heard of it? Yeah, so we actually had a meeting last night, and that's just an open forum for students to meet and talk about issues. And we have a poll every single week. We decide what issues we want to talk about. And last night we talked about the election and what work still needs to be done, which I think is something that was mentioned earlier in this panel. And it was so interesting to hear other people talk about what they think and just learn from various perspectives. And I think those open conversations where people can be honest with each other and in a space where you won't be judged for your opinion, you won't be judged for not understanding something, is the most helpful I have found. And I think those student-led discussions are where I learn the most, because I think it's hard in a classroom environment, or it's hard, especially as a high schooler who can't vote yet, to feel heard in our democracy, because I don't have the power to really show what I care about in this democracy, besides various forms of activism. So I think those conversations are very important and probably the most effective way that I have learned.
Although I also find those discussions and conversations extremely vital and important, I think something that maybe isn't stressed enough, depending on your teacher, is people really understanding the Constitution and the amendments, specifically the Bill of Rights. I think students often forget like that they have these born rights that they're given. And I think often in debates, there's such big controversy around things that people believe are stated in the Bill of Rights. So I think it's really important that all students are reminded constantly of their rights that they are given in the Bill of Rights and all the amendments. I also think Mr. Goodman brought up this topic that students aren't always aware of checks and balances, especially in the election. I think students sometimes believe that the president has and the executive branch has more power than it actually does, even though it does have so much power. But I think especially during an election time period, it's important for students to remember and learn that there is balances set in place so that the things that they might be fearing don't happen. So I think that's definitely important to relearn every year.
Do you think learning that and relearning that every year, just getting to another question in the chat, would help address some of our participation problems and how we as an advanced nation understand the notion of democracy, right? Because I often talk about in my own writings and thinking that like democracy really is a full contact sport, but it's a complex political system. And so do you think if we kept refreshing on the civic knowledge piece and then grounded it in how does it relate to you and engage in the civic action, that would help our participation in some respects, and we wouldn't be at the back of the line when it comes to participation as a developed or advanced country?
I definitely think it would. I think students are always not all students, but certain students are very passionate about like taking a stance and having a voice, but they need some form of basis to understand how to fight and how to debate and be taken seriously. So I think the constant reminder of certain things like checks and balances, Bill of Rights, and different aspects of the Constitution is important for students in order for them to be a part of these conversations.
I think I respectfully disagree. I think I agree that like having an understanding of how the government works is very important, but I don't think having that understanding is what gets people excited about politics. I know what gets me excited. I'm not super passionate about the Senate. I'm not super passionate about the Supreme Court. I'm more passionate about the fact that we need to get rid of systemic racism now. So that's why I'm like engaged in politics, because there are certain issues that I think that I want to be a part of the change to help fix. So yeah.
You know, Denora, the thing that I reflect on a lot, having been at Scarsdale now quite a while, is the ways in which we can teach resilience and tenacity as part of civic engagement. I think that I've been at Scarsdale long enough to see various political movements sort of come and go, come and go, come and go. And I've oftentimes seen students go, well, nothing's going to change because it didn't change yesterday. And I told them I wanted it to change and they didn't do it. And therefore, right. And then they become cynical and disillusioned. And the idea that citizenship requires the marathon, right? You got to be a long distance runner on this thing. And the idea that because you asked for it on Monday doesn't mean you're going to get it on Friday, right? You're going to have to sort of really advocate and push. And I think that skill, and I don't know, Martin, to what extent you guys are working on that skill, the kind of recalibrating the clock. Now, young people are impatient by nature, and I get it, but being able to sort of help people recognize that the level of engagement is not, one meeting, one phone call, one letter, but that it is that kind of persistent, ongoing, contiguous pushing for issues that matter. I think that's the thing that I really have to work on. Yeah.
I think it's the thing we all have to work on. And so Martin was getting excited. I was getting excited because this is what we talk about, right? Like it is the full contact sport, but it also requires us to all stay engaged. So it isn't just the one election, the one vote, the one click of the retweet. It's all of the work, right? On the spectrum of activity. Stephen, come on in with us. Tell us.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it's a great point. That's why tying civics in with history, luckily history is filled with historical examples of long arc that bends toward justice. And it's it's important, you know, we're not teaching civics and history separately, so we keep looping back, and luckily that the history is filled with triumphs and tragedies that show that example.
Martin, anything to add before I go to this final lightning round question and then kick it over to Leah?
Yes, I mean, it was just like, this has been such a great conversation. Like, I want to like cannonball into this school. I love what's happening. Like as it relates to like democratic classroom culture, like how that's being built into like the lives of students. And I think to John's point too, you'd be doing such a disservice to students. I mean, I think what we see in our semester long curriculum, what is integral to that process is that reflection part. Where you talk and say, yes, like change very often does not happen in a semester. If it did, the world would probably look a lot different. But what do you do with that fact, right? Yes, you worked for this thing and you didn't get it, but what does that mean? Yes, you called and they didn't respond, and you called back and they didn't respond, and you called back. Like, what does that mean? Like, there's things that can be learned that go so far beyond like, yes, we did this or we didn't do this. And I think that is so like just what I've been hearing from the past like 10, 15 minutes about what's happening inside of your own schools or your own classrooms. Just really, really exciting to hear.
Yeah. You know, Steve brings up the importance of history, and that, you know, the civil rights movement did not begin and end in 1965 with the Civil Rights Act, right? You know, there are people going as far back as A. Philip Randolph and Frederick Douglass and, you know, David Walker, right? And I think that at times, because of the culture we live in, we think of these sort of moments. So there was a speech and then things changed, right? You know, we have to develop a much more sophisticated understanding of the past.
Or from Seneca
That was
Falls,
exactly what.
yeah, or from Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment. Now, how long did that take? A long time.
Right.
72 years to be exact, because that was the example I was going to give. Because I want, yes, like when you think about 72 years, many of us think about our grandparents, right? Like your grandparents had to do something from the day they were born until today in order for change to happen. Not to mention all the years before that, when women were organizing to get to the Seneca Falls, right? And so I think, yes, it is powerful for us to be mindful of that. And then I'm going to respect and honor these young people and know that like systemic change is being catalyzed, and we're watching these movements be fueled online, right? And so social media can catalyze a movement, but it is not the movement itself yet. And so I think we have to figure out how that all happens together. Like, what's the cocktail? What's the tactics? What's the as I often say, John, and you said earlier, what are the tools in the toolbox that we're all going to use to move forward that systemic change is the lasting point I want to raise. Martin, I want you, if you could, just to put in the chat for folks, re-elevate the Democracy Doesn't Pause resources and the Beyond the Ballot toolkit resources from Generation Citizen. This doesn't end here with this conversation this evening, but I do want to end with one final lightning round question. You all had it in advance, so hopefully you're ready with an answer. I'm inspired, right? At the end of the day, it's not a zero-sum game, right? Democracy is not going to live or die today, but like we're going to keep working towards that more perfect union. It's going to be more inclusive. It's going to be more reflective. It's going to be more representative. What it takes to get there, right? To go from 75 million Americans who are eligible to vote actually participating to a number closer to 90% of eligible Americans participating is like the thing that we're working towards. If you all had this magic wand, I actually should have had a magic wand. My kids have some around here, and you could wave it. What would you want us to do on a week and 2 days after the election to make our democracy more accessible? What's the magic reform? What's the magic thing we're all going to do? I could call on you, or you could just jump in because the water's warm and it's exciting.
Yeah, stop seeing fellow Americans as the enemy, and work together to find common ground. You know, when you push past people's politics, you see we have so much more in common, and that's what we need to focus on.
Consensus building, I love it. Working past divide.
On a real concrete level, I would love to see the voting age lowered to 16. I actually think if we lower the voting age to 16, I know some places in Europe are considering doing it, it would actually make my job even more interesting than it already is. So yeah,
There's a campaign for that. Martin, tell them about Vote 16 USA in the chat. Just put it in the chat.
Yeah.
There's a whole initiative. A lot of municipalities are taking this step. Generation Citizen is a part of a coalition working to do that. And they actually got the voting age lowered for school board elections in San Francisco this year, right? Though the actual voting age didn't get lowered. So it lost close margin 50 to 49. Great progress. There are towns in Maryland that are taking this step, and it's a movement. So I agree with you. Develop the habits early before you go off to college, and the laws are different than they are in your home state. Let's all get engaged. I want to hear from a young person. Claire or Simran, tell me, what's the reform?
I also agree with Mr. Goodman. I think it's really important for us to remember that we're all Americans, we're all created equal, and that we have to work together in order to form a perfect harmony and be together as one unified nation.
Martin or Simran, come on.
Yeah, so mine was going to be lower the voting age to 16.
Stole
So, but I'll just go adjacent, and we talk about like access and creating more, or I guess taking away barriers to voting. I would say automatic voter registration.
I'll end with a controversial one. I want to say goodbye to the Electoral College.
Boom! Look at that. Yes. There's a movement for that. And it's not that controversial. It's actually gaining steam. So there you go. I agree with you. I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
National popular vote movement. We got to do it. The compact is going around. States are adopting it. We got to, every vote actually counts in the same way. And we don't have to keep Googling what's the Electoral College. I don't even know how many times I can try to explain it to 8 and 10-year-olds in the car ride. I'm like, so here's the thing. There are these electors, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I agree with you. It's not controversial because you're gonna will it to existence. I want to just thank all of you for a robust, engaging, and dynamic conversation tonight. We're still living through, as I like to say, turbulent yet inspiring times, because the change is happening and we're witnessing it right in real time. It is causing me lots of anxiety and heartache, but it is real. And for people who study democracy, want to understand it more, we are living through history in a very palpable and powerful way. And so I appreciate all of you for lending your time this evening to talk about one of those solutions, right? Civics education as a vehicle for strengthening our democracy, because I do genuinely believe if we don't demystify democracy for young people, we didn't invite them to the conversation and they're not going to participate. And so that is the work we all have to recommit ourselves to doing and to talking about beyond elections. And I'm glad that I could be here this evening to engage in this conversation. And I'm so grateful for the work that John and Stephen are doing to educate the next generation. Simran and Claire, thank you for forging the path, for leaning in and really starting your own civic journey so young. Martin, you're one of my favorite people. I'm so grateful for all you do at Generation Citizen. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Leah to close us out. Thanks, everyone.
Well, I'm going to thank you, Denora, for leading a phenomenal conversation. And to all of our panelists, thank you, Martin. Thank you, John. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Simran. Thank you, Claire, for being here tonight. And to all of our attendees, thank you for your questions. And it was wonderful. And I wish all of you well. Take good care. Be strong. We're going to make it through.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.